J. Reddy. I'm a cybersecurity expert here at ManageEngine. Guys, today's webinar is on a very important topic at this specific point in time. Things have been truly crazy over the last 1 year. We've all been working remotely. It's been a mix for a few of us, but we have made the best possible use of the available resources. We've gone remote, we've enabled our users to work remote, and there's a lot that's happened around identity access management as a landscape on the whole. So today's webinar is going to be to help you demystify how has the IAM landscape evolved, what are attackers doing these days to take advantage of the situation where your users are working from home, how are they causing cybersecurity threats to your organization. We'll try and unpack an attacker's mindset, take a deep dive into a few of attacks and scenarios that are happening as we speak, and see what exactly can we be doing to prevent or protect our organizations against these attacks. The webinar is being recorded just in case if you have any questions coming up during the course of the webinar. There's a chat window to the right of this video console. You can drop me a message. I'm going to try and take as many questions as possible during the course of the webinar. Just in case if I miss a question or two, don't worry, I'm going to have them answered towards the end of the webinar. So today's webinar is about preventing Active Directory password attacks. What are the steps that you should be essentially taking, and what are the tools can you be using? That is the idea, and let's get started with the webinar. The focus is Active Directory, as it's mentioned. The whole idea right here is AD has been around for almost about 2 decades now. Organizations around the world, regardless of their nature, regardless of what sort of business they're into, many a times, 8 out of 10 times use Active Directory as their IAM platform or as their directory services. So we are going to try and understand the innate or native limitations of Active Directory and where it falls short from a password security standpoint. We'll talk about how password attacks happen. We'll kind of try and unpack an attacker's mindset and see why exactly are passwords an attacker's favorite target. A couple of misconfigurations that are quite common in Active Directory and how to kind of steer clear from them. A few reasons as to why users tend to set weak passwords and how attackers exploit, and what should we be doing as administrators and security folks to essentially foolproof the whole password security problem right here. And AD360 is the ManageEngine offering that will be helping us getting the job done. So we'll be talking about that a little bit, right? So when it comes to Active Directory, almost 2 decades old, there's not been much of a change to how Active Directory or Microsoft has approached the whole IAM security. Nothing path breaking, nothing has changed much. Active Directory has been for a very, very long time at the core of IAM. Now, as we speak, organizations, while working remotely, have moved towards a place where it's hybrid, where they're trying to use Azure AD or another cloud platform like, let's say, Office 365 or G Suite to manage their user identities. And end of the day, if you still see it's all going to be interconnected, it's going to be a hybrid setup where AD cannot be taken out of your system. So it's inevitable. The whole idea right here is to ensure that we understand that this is how it's going to be for a few more years for sure, and how do we navigate through this landscape, understanding the native limitations of this platform. So while working remotely, attackers are taking advantage. You know how difficult it is going to be for you to manage your organization. Back in the day, while users were at work, it was a challenge, but now when users are away, it's a bigger challenge, and a lot of times it becomes much more difficult because of the human element, because of the whole unpredictability that is associated with your users and how they access your resources. So it becomes very difficult if your Active Directory is compromised, because attackers don't just aim at compromising your AD, they want everything that is around your organization associated with your Active Directory, the resources, the devices, the user identities and whatnot. Compromising a credential is just the start of things. If you take a trip down the memory lane in 2018, there were attacks that focused on compromising employee data. The idea was to just steal a few employee data, but the attacker ended up getting hold of the admin credential for the entire organization. They used that credential to stay in the organization for much longer than they had planned. They waited it out. They had exfiltrated every piece of information that they could possibly get their hold of. They destroyed the intellectual property. They did not leave behind a trace. They tried to cover up the whole mess. So it becomes very difficult. Even Microsoft agrees that once an attacker gets into the system, they get hold of the domain admin credentials, they start laterally moving. They start escalating their privileges. And even before you know, your entire security can calm down. Everything that is associated with your business, not just the IT, anything and everything that your IT is a part of becomes compromised. That is the challenge that we're dealing with right here. And how do they go about doing it? They can do a lot more. They can start sending out malicious emails from your corporate accounts. They can pretend to be employees in your organization, ask for payments from other vendors. They can try executing a ransomware attack, which is the most common one, the obvious course of action in most cases, where the attackers encrypt critical files in your organization and demand for a ransom to decrypt it. And with the whole deal of crypto available for attackers these days, they can stay as anonymous as possible and get the whole transaction done. In terms of privilege escalation, this is usually an ulterior motive. They wish to escalate their privileges. They do that. They try and cover their tracks if they want to remain in your system for an extended period of time without tipping off any of your existing radars or tipping off your existing SIM solutions for that matter. This is what they do. They laterally move. They do not leave many breadcrumbs behind. They escalate their privileges in such a fashion that it does not trigger any alarms, and they use multiple accounts at the same times to achieve their end goal. That way, it's not just going to be one account. They are going to be all over the place doing it parallelly. Even if you were to detect that one of these accounts were compromised, by which time they would have already had a backdoor access through another account. That is the idea. So they compromise every sort of resource, both physical and digital resources that you have. They create backdoor accesses just in case if you kick them out of your system, if you do a sweep, they are going to come back because they must have for sure used that time and the admin credential to create a backdoor access for themselves. That is the idea right here. So as we go about, it is important that we understand that password compromises are the most easiest way that an attacker looks for to get into your organization. And hence, passwords are probably the attacker's most favorite target. A couple of reasons why it becomes very easy for attackers: major organization, big names in the industry, tech companies, and almost every sort of company out there at some point in time gets compromised because employees use weak passwords, because employees tend to reuse their existing passwords. You can't really blame them. The whole idea of human behavior is to find the easiest way out, and people in general tend to find passwords to be a challenge to remember. With all the complexity requirements that we may have in place, they might tend to set a password that's strong at times, but not necessarily different passwords for different platforms. They might probably be using the same password for their personal account, which got compromised in another attack. And today, if you head all over to the web, especially the dark web, you would find millions of credentials of users, commonly used passwords, accounts that are compromised. In fact, if you want to do a quick check, here's my recommendation. Grab a pen and paper and write this URL down. It's called haveibeenpwned.com, HAVEIPAWNED.com. So this website essentially helps you check if any of your credentials are compromised in any of the common attacks. Most of the time, what happens is you don't end up realizing that you're using stolen credentials. You do not know if any other personal account got compromised. You'd still be using that for your corporate account and endangering your organization too in the process. So people in general are probably the biggest reason why security fails happen across organizations at every level. If you were to take note, password reuse is one of the major challenges that administrators face. When you go about ensuring that users don't set weak passwords, there are other challenges. The native systems like Active Directory, they have restrictions in terms of what password policy can they set. You can't be 100% sure and tell me that Active Directory does not let a user set a password like password at 123. You can have all sorts of security combinations in place, uppercase, lowercase, and whatnot, but still it lets users set dictionary words, predictable words, and users are predictable. And there are tons of information out there, loads of passwords that were stolen in the past. There are devices, there are equipments, there are bots that are super sophisticated that can analyze people's password patterns, come up with new passwords, keep spraying them till they crack your organization. So setting a weak password is probably another important reason why passwords are easy to crack for attackers. You can't really again blame the users, because if they are allowed to set a weak password, worry not, they're definitely going to set a weak password. So existing directory services like Active Directory or Azure AD for that matter need to change how they look at passwords, but that doesn't seem to be happening. It's been 2 decades and there's not been a considerable upgrade to the password policy. So you'll have to kind of think of ways to foolproof it. Either look for solutions that can strengthen the password policy, sit on top of existing AD policies, or look for solutions that can foolproof your password security or identity security. Later today, I'll kind of try and unpack a few options to foolproof your password security. Now, again, like I said, fatigue is a big reason for your users. They tend to become tired of remembering multiple passwords. You can't really blame them. With the whole remote working, they have access to at least 10 new extra applications, helping them collaborate and whatnot. So they tend to use weak passwords. And with the whole social login and bring your own identity becoming a thing these days, users tend to bring their Facebook and Google IDs over to work and use in applications that are of corporate importance. So the whole idea right here is to ensure that your users build a tendency to set strong passwords. They don't use passwords that are easily compromisable. You start with educating them. You tell them what exactly should they be doing and set processes in place that foolproof the whole thing. That is the idea with which you should proceed further. So what we've done so far is we've kind of taken cue from the fact that users are the reasons for most of the attacks. Users tend to set weak passwords, they tend to reuse passwords, and they tend to fall prey for the whole process of password fatigue. Now what we'll try and do is we'll try and address the software element too. What happens because of certain misconfigurations. Especially when it comes to Active Directory, there are two major problems that keep arising all the time. Even experienced administrators at times miss out on this. Now, the most common problem is local admin privilege. Now, this is a rampant issue these days, especially because of the fact that users have started working remotely. Your users are going to demand access to many applications. They would want to prioritize accessibility over security. They would want to get things done right away. And in the process, while they're working remotely, administrators are pushed to give them access to their local devices. Many a times it could be a matter of them not being able to connect to the domain controller, them not being able to update or upgrade or do the latest patch. So these issues while working remotely are still being navigated through, addressed, because back in the day, let's say in 2019, only 5% of the entire world's population was working remotely. Now today, as you see, it's more than 60% of the world population that's gone remote. The corporate requires you to adhere to certain rules. They would want you to follow certain best practices, but while users are working remotely, there's how much that you can expect them to adhere to. So that becomes a challenge, and administrators end up giving privileges to users, which in turn become the major reason for attacks. And attackers can very much snoop into a user's home Wi-Fi and get hold of all sorts of accesses. It's that easy to crack through, and attackers these days are becoming very nifty. They're becoming smart about how they go about getting whole real world about it. They are trying to get physical. They are trying to be present in close proximity to key stakeholders in the organization, try and exfiltrate data through a man-in-the-middle attack and whatnot. So that is the idea right here. Local administrator credentials given to users are always dangerous. And another problem is at times organizations tend to have, for the sake of ease, they tend to have the same credential across accounts. They might have a strong password. Only few people might know the secret. But still, the same local admin credential can be used across organization, across devices, which makes it very vulnerable. So this is one of the major reasons that can essentially lead to a password attack. Local administrator accounts getting compromised. This is a problem. The second one is service accounts. Now, service accounts are absolutely necessary for organizations. Very many applications run based on service accounts and the privileges that they have. At times, it becomes difficult and overwhelming to manage or upgrade credentials of service accounts. In those instances, there is where the problem arises. They have weak passwords, they're set to never expire, and when these accounts are used to probably, let's say, temporarily install the software, they go unchecked because there's no tracking mechanism to revoke the access, and then one application or the other, a malware or the other, is going to try, do a reconnaissance, find out that there's this account that has these vulnerable credentials, take control of that account, and even before you know, the rest is history. So these are probably the two most common misconfigurations administrators need to steer clear from. Have this in mind, and there's a lot that you could save, a lot of trouble that you could save your organization from if these two misconfigurations aren't these two misconfigurations are addressed. That is the idea right here. And when it comes to weak passwords, again, we'll talk about a couple of exploits. That's the next part of this session. We're going to try and understand how attackers go about creating havoc. How do they do a remote desktop protocol brute force attack? What do they do to do a password spray attack? How do they get hold of credentials of users over social engineering through a spear phishing attack? So this is exactly what we'll be unpacking in the next 20 minutes. So we'll try and start with the brute force attack, the most common one, the most generic one per se. It's probably even the most easiest one. Someone without much of an experience as an attacker or a hacker can very much initiate a brute force attack with a few tutorials on YouTube. You'd become an expert. You can get hold of brute force tools that can help you do a brute force attack or automate an entire brute force attack if you have the right credentials. In cases where it's an insider attack, brute force attacks are very common because insiders who intend to cause damage, who intend to take control over a few accounts or privilege escalate their accounts, start with brute force attacks. Tutorials are available readily online, and in fact, you'd be surprised as to how easy it is to get hold of credentials if a user is a part of the domain. So brute force attacks are pesky in that way, but existing systems or security systems in place have been over the course of time upgraded to understand the nature of brute force attacks. A couple of brute force attacks, if you do not have a security system in place to look out for. Simple brute force attacks are straightforward. They're automations where a script is run to crack your password. Multiple passwords are attempted over an account until the account gets locked out. So brute force attack tools are a little smart. They try and understand what's your password policy first. They see what is the account lockout threshold. They stop right when they are about to hit the account lockout threshold. So that way they don't lock out accounts and trigger unnecessary attention. So these are simple brute force attacks. Dictionary attacks are a form of brute force attacks where the tool takes reference from a dictionary, creates a permutation and combination of words from a dictionary, and then starts spraying. This is how it works. So even if your users tend to set passwords that aren't predictable, like a password at 1, 2, 3, but still, if they end up using dictionary words, a dictionary attack can very well get the job done in a matter of minutes. With respect to hybrid attacks, these are a combination of simple attacks and brute force attacks where words, numbers, phrases, and certain contextual parameters pertaining to the organization are used as source for the attack. So this way the success rate of the attack is much higher because you have certain personal information of the users to you use that as a part of the permutation combination and get the job done. And when it comes to credential stuffing, most of the time it happens after the credentials are already compromised or available on the dark web. If the attacker gets the slightest hint of such data available online, they are going to grab hold of that, use that to initiate the attack. The success rate is much higher because the user's password was already compromised in another attack or in another platform. So it is imperative that you have a system in place that frequently checks the security of your password. It becomes difficult to do that, and it usually falls as a responsibility for the end user itself. If you take Google for that matter, you must have noticed in recent times where Google gives you a security alert saying there's one recommendation that they have for you, and they tell you that this specific credential that you've saved on their Google Vault for password is weak and was compromised in an attack in the past. So that is how tools are evolving. They're becoming dynamic in understanding if you're using weak passwords that have been compromised and give you suggestions or recommendations that ask your users not to use them. That's the idea. And then yes, the traditional password spray attack, it's a step ahead to brute force attack in terms where it does not raise red flags. It chooses one specific password over a regression, has it applied or sprayed over multiple accounts. That way one password gets sprayed over multiple accounts, that way not triggering any sort of alarm at all. It becomes almost impossible to detect such behavior unless you have user behavior analytics, where you track user behavior, where you track deviations of such nature. It's very difficult to find out a password spray attack. A couple of examples. These ones are essentially going to help you unpack or probably even do a root cause analysis if you fall prey for a brute force attack. So the trick right here is, right when you figure out there's a brute force attack happening, is to stop, shut down every system that's available, do a master password reset for all your accounts, request your users to upgrade and set up MFA. That's the way forward if you were to ever find yourself being attacked brute force. I'd probably try and demystify one of these cases where it's an RDP attack. RDP attacks are very common these days while your users are trying to access their resources over a remote connection. This happens if there are weak passwords or open RDP ports used in the process. It becomes a cakewalk for the attacker because there are very many tools out there that are going to analyze your ports to see which ones are open, which ones are easy to spread a ransomware, and they get into your organization and get going, getting access to all your information. So the anatomy is pretty straightforward. The attackers use a tool. Nmap is most commonly used. If there's a weak credential or a cracked password, they're going to use that. They're going to use a tool like Crowbar to brute force into your organization, and once they gain access into your organization, they're going to infiltrate and infect your system with a ransomware. So RDP attacks are much more prevalent. There's a 30% spike in RDP attacks that we've noticed over the last 6 months, essentially because organizations have started exposing their internal applications over the web. So if you are bound to do that, if there's no other go and that you're required to expose an internal application over the web for your employees, it is important that you have extra layers of security in place. It is important that there's an SSL certification involved, there's a multi-factor authentication involved. Even for that matter, you can have a few validation questions in place, no problem at all. It might look like extra effort for your users to log in, but it might save a great deal of trouble from these attacks. That's the idea right here. So you can try and understand this a little later in the webinar. Probably I'll try and show you how it's done. All right. In terms of cracking passwords of domain users using a password spray attack, again, it's very straightforward. There are a few tools involved. With basic privileges in a domain, attacker can initiate a password spray attack, select a list, start spraying that against a list of users, right? Password spray attacks, again, they're effective for an attacker because they go totally unnoticed and they go under the radar. That is why attackers prefer a password spray. I'm going to try and use a couple of minutes to show you a demo of how password spray attacks happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and emulate a password spray attack right here. The intention of a password spray attack is to compromise credentials of privileged users or other users alike. Now the requirement is I have already compromised. I am in that stage of the whole kill chain that I've entered into the organization, and I have provisions to execute PowerShell commands. I'm starting with a quick bypass on the PowerShell. I'll start with an import of a module from the password spray tool that I've downloaded from Git. It's straightforward and easily available for access. So I'm invoking and importing the module called domain password spray. It's a PowerShell script again. Invoke domain password spray. And I will select what is going to be that weak password that I want to try or spray against users. Here it's going to be test at 123. Once that's done, it's pretty instantaneous. It looks up for all the users in my organization. It starts spraying test at 123. Now it's created a list of users to spray. There appears to be no lockout policy. Users who are disabled are removed just to stop it from not hitting a dead end, and there are totally 6 users who are found. Perfect. So I, after having run, have the results right here. There's Steve Wozniak, Jack Dorsey, and client who are users inside the organization with test at 123 as password. It's as straightforward as that. It takes into account any account lockout policy just so that it does not trigger an unwanted account lockout. It can very much fly under the radar, right? Now what I want to do is I want to find out the list of all users in the organization, try and use a permutation and combination of different passwords so that my success rate is more and I crack through a privileged account. So I will start by removing disabled users. They are a dead end. I'm not going to have any use for them. So the list will not have any disabled users. I would also want to remove any sort of potential lockout possibilities. For users whose lockouts are just one password or one wrong password away, I'm having them removed. And I want the output file of the list of users to be in this specific format, which is a text file that is encoded in ASCII, a text file, a simple text file that I can use at a later stage to initiate the password spray attack for the entire organization. So these are handpicked users who are most vulnerable, and the ones using weak passwords, the ones who will not trigger a notification if there's a SIM tool. Accounts don't get locked out. That's the idea. And now my user list is going to get ready in no time. The list is created. Lockout policy is checked for. Disabled users are removed. I find 6 users. Since it's a test environment, I just have 6 users right here. In an ideal scenario, you'd have more. So let me see how the list looks like. There you go. I've got all the users in my organization, including the administrator right there. Right. Now what I intend to do is again run the password spray tool, but this time I would want to use a list of passwords. Essentially, a password spray and a dictionary attack can go hand in hand. I would want to invoke my domain password spray PowerShell script right here. I would want to match it against the user list I've just generated. So I'm handpicking the list of users who are to be password sprayed. I am selecting the instance from where, or the domain from where it's going to be run. The password list that has to be sprayed across is selected. Now I would want an output file again in a text format that says which user has what password. It can't get any easier, can it now? So output file is going to be sprayed credentials.txt, and you would see how quick it works to generate a Word file that has the list of users and whose passwords are weak from the list of sprayed passwords. So here we've got test at 123. This list can be long. So again, all sorts of precautions are taken. It's asking me if I want to do the password spray account these accounts. I'm saying yes. And then the output is ready. The password spray has been successful. Let me quickly open the file to see. There you go. So we know there are 4 users in the organization who've used a weak password from the list right here. So So this is the sorry state of organizations. Attackers have become extremely nifty. They have the tools that need very minimal access to get into your organization. So this is the sorry state of organizations. Attackers have become extremely nifty. They have the tools that need very minimal access to get into your organization, initiate one of these attacks, and the know-how that needs to go into the whole attack is also very basic. Anybody with access to YouTube can learn how to initiate one of these password spray attacks and get away with it. That's just one part of the problem, but then there's another major problem where our users get socially engineered. Now we're talking about a case where users get phished. Users are entrapped, users are made to believe that they're doing the right thing, and attackers try to leverage their incapability to make such decisions when they are online. So your users are the weakest link in your organization. They tend to fall victim, especially since the onset of the pandemic. Attackers have become very nifty in making use of the situation that's presented itself. They started sending out emails pretending to be the World Health Organization or the CDC, saying that they have found the cure for COVID, or there's a new vaccine out there, or people are in general interested to know what's happening, and they end up clicking these links. In fact, in India, from where I'm presenting today, there was this case where attackers became very smart, sent out emails saying that the government is giving away a relief fund for those infected with COVID, or to just help them in general, and then they had asked for bank details. And even before the government could put a lid on top of this, things happened very quickly, and even within a day's time a lot of damage had happened. So that's the whole deal right here. As we go forward with the whole remote working, educating our users to these new types of attacks again is of top priority. So spear phishing attacks can be a major problem. Traditionally, spear phishing attacks have been out there for quite some time now. All that the attacker does is wait. They understand your user. They kind of even go to the extent of profiling your user to an extent where they know when exactly do they sleep, when exactly do they head out, what do they do, what do they like, what is their favorite movie, what's the music that they listen to, so that they can profile your users and wait for that opportunity that presents itself and plant one of those malicious links in a place where the user would find and get them to click it and get going with the information. What had happened at Armor Blocks is a classic case. Users received an email from the attackers. These attackers maintained a very cordial relationship, proper business communication for quite some time with the users in the organization. So they were bound to assume that these were legitimate emails. They clicked on that email, and when they clicked on it, it got redirected to an Office 365 login like page. This was a lookalike page that the attackers had put together. The idea was they pretended not just to be lookalike pages, they also made it look very legitimate with a disclaimer saying, because you're accessing sensitive info, you need to verify your password. So users thought they were doing something very secure and gave away their password, but this was a dummy form that sent out a copy of the passwords to the attacker, while the other copy of it was used through an Office 365 API call to check if those were the actual right credentials. And if they were the right credentials, there was a redirection to Zoom. This was more like a distraction. If it were not the case, they were redirected to the Microsoft logon page to mask that there was a failed logon. So the worst part of this attack was the users who fell victim for this attack never knew that they were being attacked, number one, and weren't able to report that their credentials were stolen. So for a long time, the organization never really got to know that this is how the attackers got hold of the credentials. So as we speak, day in, day out, our users are bound to do something like this. So we will need to be a step ahead of the attackers, and users need to be foolproof. So I've got a couple of action items right here that you must implement without no doubt. We were talking about brute force attacks, we were talking about password spray attacks and phishing attacks on the whole. So I've kind of put together mandatory steps to mitigate these attacks. The first one, the most important one, is to track logon behavior. When there is a deviation in logon behavior, that's a clear sign of an attack. If there are multiple logon failures or repetitive logon failures that are happening at a short interval of time, and then there's a successful logon a little later, it obviously means that your organization is under brute force attack and a user's account got compromised. So you will need clear protocols that ensure account lockout happens in time. It's not just the account lockout. In the example or the demonstration that I just showed you, the tool is smart enough to understand what's the account lockout threshold and stop right before it hits the threshold. So what do you do in such cases? You would need user behavior analytics to track deviation in behavior. So in addition to that, certain fundamental housekeeping that you need to have in place is protection against dictionary attacks. So users tend to set dictionary words in their passwords. They are bound to go through password fatigue, as we discussed. So you must have a provision to prevent your users from using dictionary words or predictable words. The easiest way to go about is to enforce passphrases as a best practice. Longer the password, higher the password entropy, more difficult it becomes to crack. Even if your attacker has a sophisticated supercomputer working their way, if the password is 20 characters long with a mix of special characters, numbers, I don't know, hieroglyphics, you would make it very difficult for the attacker. That's the kind of passphrases that you should get your users to set. Something that is strong, something that is long. That's the idea right here. And in terms of MFA in general, it's a common denominator. Irrespective of what sort of password attack you're talking about, multi-factor authentication can get the job done. It will be that second layer of defense, more like a foolproof mechanism that your attacker cannot jimmy pick. That's the whole idea right here. Now, as we go forward, we'll also have to have options to monitor privilege activity, because many times right after the attack, the attacker would want to escalate the privileges. So this can work your way or in your favor. If you want to backtrack a privilege escalation, most likely it happens right after an attack. You'd be able to call that out. In case of a password spray attack, now this is where the attackers get smart. They defy or deflect all sorts of radar or measures that you have in place. So you need stringent password policies that do not let your users compromise your identity security. What do I mean? I'm talking about strong passwords that are not predictable, the ones that don't form patterns. It does not have consecutive numbers like 1 2 3 4 5 or QWERTY. We call that keyboard waltzing. Your users tend to do that a lot of times, so you should have stringent policies there again. And then when it comes to MFA, no doubt it's going to help you prevent, even if the account gets compromised, the second layer is not going to be possibly crackable. The attacker can use one password that can be sprayed across the organization but cannot necessarily get hold of the second factor. In most cases, if it's a personal factor, if it's a possession factor, it's much more effective. So look for such options too. In terms of phishing attacks, now your users need to be educated. Bottom line, for the last 20 years, people have been falling prey for phishing attacks. The easiest way to get about solving this problem is to start educating your users. You might have very strong email malware policy or anti-malware policy or data leak prevention policy on your Office 365 or your Outlook. You might have these policies, but then still attackers can become smart. They can make your email look very straightforward. They can mask the link very effectively and get your users to click on something. It could be a redirection, you never know. So your users need to be educated. That's the bottom line. So you cannot make the decision for them every single time. The best way to do them is to give them a guidelines, give them a training, tell them what they can click and what they cannot. It's a very important piece of information that they should be filled into. And in terms of going forward with phishing attacks, there's an easy way. Right after a phishing attack happens, they won't literally move. So you must ensure that your VPN is secure, because while working remotely, we saw how RDP attack happens. So your remote work or force must be protected. VPNs can have multi-factor authentications and your systems need to be patched all the time. That's again a very important requirement. You talk about the Microsoft zero-day exploit that happened quite recently, Exchange exploit. You never really know what is waiting for you on the other side. So the best case scenario, have all your devices patched while working remotely, while your users are not connected to the network or the domain. It can get a little difficult, but still make it a point that you have a solution that can have your latest patches disseminated and installed. That's something that's very important and it's absolutely required. So a couple of points right here, a few steps quickly giving you a recap. Passwords need to be stronger than the basic password policy. They must not be predictable. Users must not be allowed to use words from the dictionary. Setting up a second factor of authentication can do a great deal of help. Tracking privileged activity is something that you should be considering. Ensuring that you have new age VPNs and firewalls again is very important. Have them configured up to notch, the best or the most stringent security policy, and do not water down. Even if your users prioritize accessibility over security, you need to take that call. So to do this, tool can essentially help you. In this case, AD360 is the Managed Engine IAM offering that can sit on top of your Active Directory, Azure AD, Office 365 or G Suite or any other IAM application that you have and enforce a stronger password policy. We want to defend ourselves against weak passwords. So the easiest way to do is strengthen it, where your users cannot set predictable passwords or dictionary words or patterns, or the pattern engine is so smart that it stops users from using patterns that are predictable. We want to ensure that users set strong passwords and go about doing a general overall password hygiene. As a password hygiene, you have these policies enforced in place. And when I'm talking about compromised passwords, these again are a problem irrespective of how strong your password policies are. Even if your users don't use dictionary words, or even if your users don't use predictable passwords, they can always fall victim for a password that's already compromised. So they must be using the same password across different applications. If that's the case, even if the password is strong, if it's compromised in one case, the attacker is going to use that list to compromise your corporate identity too. Have I Been Pawned, like I pointed out earlier in the webinar today, can be a great resource that can help you stop users from setting passwords that have been compromised. So look for solutions that extend beyond just minimum password length. Casing, special characters, numbers would also help you have a provision to block dictionary words, patterns, stop weak passwords, show you a checklist of what needs to be done, and also verify if your password is up to date or it's the most favorable one. So these are certain things that you can ensure from a password complexity standpoint. And from an MFA standpoint, you would want a solution that is very handy and flexible, that's easy to install and that can work across platforms. Your users are going to resist if you give them something new to do, especially while working remotely. It becomes very difficult for administrators to get something done. So that being the case, you would want a system or a mobile authenticator that gets the job done. Microsoft's mobile authenticator is free and it's easy to install. It works across platforms, iOS, Android. It easily integrates and gets the job done. And other integrators or other authenticators also work with Face ID and Touch ID. That's a beautiful use case right there for you. And The best possible way, if you're an administrative account or if you have privileged accounts, is to have a physical key. Nothing better than that. A possession factor is always better than a knowledge factor, because users tend to forget, they tend to write it down, they tend to make mistakes if it's a knowledge factor. But it's a possession factor. Unless it's stolen, it's difficult to crack through it. So look for options for your MFA and see if it's flexible. And it's not just about having MFA for applications. It is at multiple levels. It's at a logon level where endpoints get protected. Windows, Mac PCs can have a second factor of authentication, or at a platform level where you have a platform like a VPN or some portal or an internal application that needs protection through a second factor or a VPN or a multi-factor authentication. So it is helpful in such regard. A more sophisticated way of looking at MFA, this is a mandatory checkbox irrespective of what sort of platform or environment you have. A more sophisticated way would be to look at it from a conditional access standpoint. We call it adaptive authentication. So AD360 becomes your brain for your authentication. It's much more smarter than the default MFA. It understands context, it draws baselines for users, it analyzes their past behavior using machine learning, draws a profile, a risk profile to be precise, that takes into account the biometric of the user from the past, be it the network from where they access, the device that they use to access, or the geography from the access, or the time of the day they usually access. All these biometrics along with 15 other factors get taken into account, and a decision is made every single time they try to log on. So if the user is not who they claim to be, the system is going to notify you. It's going to make the whole thing stringent. There's going to be a few more factors. The user needs to prove that they are who they claim to be. If the user checks all these boxes, right network, right device, right geographic location, right working hours, and right biometrics, the access gets made easier. So that's the whole idea. It has two advantages. One, it makes access easier while working remotely, and at the same time it makes it very stringent if the system detects a deviation in behavior. Administrators are loving this functionality. This is probably the game-changing technology that can change how authentication has been happening. We are looking at engineering something called as continuous authentication, which is the next step to conditional access. We are in the process of building it. Eventually there'll be a point where authentication happens every single second. Your user, even if they probably, let's say, leave their laptop or desktop open, if there's deviation in behavior, biometrics get recorded and it can be locked. The account can be locked or the screen can be locked. Such factors are coming into play, but it's probably, let's say, 2 to 3 years from now. That's the future that authentication is going to have. So to start with, before we head or think about or evaluate conditional access or adaptive access, MFA, that's the checkbox that you definitely need to have in place. So do enforce MFA. Does not matter if it's AD360 or any other tool. My kind request is have a tool. There are many free options out there, including the Microsoft Mobile Authenticator. If you are an existing AD organization or an Azure organization, use that. Please do use that. And when it comes to single sign-on, nothing straightforward than single sign-on. Users do not need to remember multiple passwords. Handshakes to these applications happen at the back end, so your application access is very secure. Users need not enter. So in the case where we saw where users enter their passwords on an Office 365 lookalike platform, that's never going to happen because single sign-on is going to take care. Users will never ever get to enter passwords, and the authentication happens is pre-authenticated, pre-verified. That way it's much more secure than letting them fill out. So that's a great way to counter potential phishing attacks. And when it comes to AD360, it helps you do one more thing, which is user behavior analytics. Now, this is going to be the factor that's going to give you the cutting edge. The idea is to scale beyond native limitations and ensure that you start analyzing users' behavior. If there's an unusual volume of activity happening in a different time of day and the new resources being accessed, your system will notify you the unusual behavior. It will tell you where exactly did it initiate from, which machine, which endpoint, what service was accessed, what device was used, from where did this happen. All of those details get recorded and notified. If there's a lateral movement which happens right after an attack, you get notified. You can contain the lateral movement as it progresses by kicking out the user or resetting password or locking out their accounts. All of this will become possible. And if there's a malware, absolutely is going to be out of question, because even before the installation can kick in, the deviation in behavior is noticed. it gets blocked. A new application cannot be installed by a user who does not have the privilege or did not do it in the past. And talking about that, if someone tries to abuse their privileges, that is also taken into account. If there's a deviation in who the user is or what sort of activity are they doing with their privilege, that gets notified and the administrator can get on top of the situation. So these are a few cases where you can essentially counter an attack. If it's a password attack or a breach, identity compromise and credential thievery is a very big challenge that usually leads to privilege escalation, data loss, lateral movement, and capturing of corporate resources, or in the end of the day, a ransom or deleting some intellectual property. So you can stop all of that as it happens if you have a tool that does user behavior analytics. Now, getting a new tool implemented while working remotely can be a challenge. Very understandable. Even if it's going to take you some time to have all this implemented, start right here. Right, you can start tracking these activities. The 5 that I've listed are very important. Logon activity on your Active Directory can be tracked through 5624 and 5625. These two event IDs are going to come in handy if you want to track logon activity. If there's any deviation, let's say repeated logon failures, you can set an alert or get notified. Similarly, if there are modifications to group membership, you would know if a new user gets added to a security group. If some security group is disabled, you should be notified and you should keep a track of it. And if there's an unusual volume of account lockout, you know what that is. That could be a brute force attack. If there are new files that are being accessed for the first time or a failed attempt to access a file, you should be notified. For file integrity monitoring, 4663 can get the job done for you. And most importantly, if an attacker gets into your system, does all that he or she wants, and tries to leave your system without raising a red flag, the event log clearance can be that specific hook that can get your attacker for you. So if an attacker tries to clear their breadcrumbs, this is the event ID that's going to help you find out. When you're doing a root cause analysis, this is the first place where you look at. So these 5 event categories of event IDs, please do have them enabled. I've got a list of 25 event IDs, 25 categories to be precise. You can drop me a message right now on the chat. I'm going to make note of your email ID, and a little later I'm going to email you the details of those event IDs. Thank you so much for being such a lovely audience. I honestly and sincerely hope the session today was helpful. We discussed about password challenges that organizations face, how native systems like Active Directory innately have challenges with respect to policies, how attackers are making use of the situation that's presented itself to initiate COVID-based attacks on organization, and how can we potentially mitigate with a few best practices that we discussed, and how AD360, the Manage Engine tool, can get a few of these tasks done for you. You've been a lovely audience. I've tried to take a few questions while I presented. I'm sure I'm going to have more questions right away. I'm going to have all of them answered. I'm going to stick around for another 15 minutes to take all your questions. So feel free to make use of the opportunity. I'm available on the live chat. You can talk to me and I'm going to respond. Just in case if you want any resource, the slide deck or the demo that I showed you, or any details further pertaining to the product itself, my email ID is on the screen and I'm available on the chat. You can absolutely reach out to me. Do stay safe. Take care. Talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.